The night sky over Baghdad was supposed to light up with missile trails, tracer fire, and radar pings. Instead, it stayed silent until the explosions began. At precisely 2:38 a.m. on January 17th, deep inside Iraq's capital, command bunkers, communication hubs, and air defense centers erupted into flame. Shockwaves ripped through reinforced concrete. Entire systems went offline before operators even registered an alarm. In a subterranean control room beneath the Ministry of Defense, a Soviet-trained radar crew scrambled for answers. Their screens remained blank. Not jammed, not confused, just blank. There were no aircraft, no echoes, no warnings. But above their heads, invisible shapes had already crossed the Tigris River. The F-117, a Nighthawk, America's black triangle of myth, had arrived. And with it came the end of radar, as the world had known it. It wasn't just that these aircraft couldn't be tracked. It was the precision. One F-117 dropped a laser-guided bomb through the air vent of a hardened bunker. Another split a central telecommunications tower in two. High above, wild weasels waited to suppress any air defenses that might respond. But nothing responded. Iraq's air defense system, the most dense outside of Moscow, built on Soviet doctrine, stocked with SA-2 seconds, SA-3 seconds, and ZSU-2, 3, 4 seconds, fired into darkness, hoping for a miracle. There were none. In Moscow, GRU and KGB analysts watched early satellite imagery with mounting horror. Baghdad's defenses hadn't failed, they had never even engaged. The city had been scalpeled, not bombed. Not a single F-117 was lost. At U.S. Central Command, a simple message crackled through secure lines from an F-117 pilot after completing his run. Targets hit. No contact. Returning clean. That was the moment Soviet air defense collapsed, not physically, but conceptually, because nothing in their manuals accounted for this. Nothing in their doctrine predicted it. And now, inside every radar bunker from Hanoi to Havana, one terrifying question echoed. If they can strike Baghdad, what can they reach next? The war rooms in Baghdad were not unprepared, at least, not according to Soviet doctrine. More than 3,000 surface-to-air missile launchers formed a defensive web across Iraq. Over 16,000 anti-aircraft artillery guns stood ready. Dozens of radar arrays imported, installed, and operated with Soviet technical guidance, watched the skies 24 hours a day. Baghdad was layered with low, medium, and high-altitude threat rings, each designed to detect, track, and destroy incoming aircraft before they could breach the city. And yet, none of that would matter. In the final days before Operation Desert Storm, Soviet advisors and their Iraqi counterparts pored over air defense plans. The assumption was clear. No aircraft could penetrate the capital without triggering at least one of the radar nets. The enemy would be seen then swarmed by SAMs and gunfire. What they did not anticipate was the enemy being designed never to be seen at all. Inside the command rooms of the Iraqi Air Defense Command, Soviet doctrine was gospel. Charts showed overlapping radar coverage. Probability tables predicted interception success based on altitude, velocity, and radar cross-section. The highest threat scenario envisioned mass raids of conventional bombers, escorted by fighters and preceded by jamming aircraft. Tactical plans assumed radar saturation or spoofing, not total erasure. No one expected stealth to be real. Not like this. Soviet military journals, those few that acknowledged Western stealth experiments, dismissed it as fragile, hypothetical, or impractical for combat. Radar-absorbent materials were seen as maintenance nightmares. Airframes optimized for stealth were thought to sacrifice too much in speed, payload, or survivability. The F-117 broke all of that. Back in Baghdad, officers waited on screen returns that never came. Intercepts were never launched. Alerts were never triggered. The first clue something had gone wrong wasn't on radar, it was the sound of explosions. Bunkers lost power. Communications went silent. Generals who had memorized radar codes now stood surrounded by silence and the acrid smoke of precision-guided munitions. This wasn't the first time Soviet systems had failed to stop American aircraft, but it was the first time they'd never even known they were under attack. The horror wasn't just military, it was existential, because the F-117 didn't just defeat the Soviet-designed air defense network. It bypassed the very physics those defenses were built on. If Baghdad, arguably the most fortified Soviet client capital, could be penetrated without resistance, then everything Moscow had sold, taught, and believed was now under threat. Not someday, but now. It wasn't a gap in coverage. It wasn't a failure of readiness. It was the total collapse of a belief system. And no amount of jamming, firepower, or doctrine could stop what they couldn't see coming. The doctrine had been written decades earlier. Born in Moscow, refined in Hanoi, and exported across the Soviet-aligned world. It was elegant in its simplicity. No matter how fast or high the enemy flew, radar would see them. Surface-to-air missiles would engage them, and massed firepower, layered and redundant, would break their back. But that doctrine was built on a fatal assumption, that everything in the sky could be seen. From the Soviet point of view, air defense was a mathematical system. A network of inputs, radar returns, trajectory projections, missile response times fed into a central logic. The aircraft would appear, and the system would respond. It had worked in the past. In Vietnam, the SA-2 downed hundreds of American aircraft. In the Middle East, SAM traps threatened Israeli jets. The concept was validated in blood. So when the U.S. began experimenting with stealth in the 1,970 seconds, Soviet analysts paid attention but not respect. They believed the trade-offs were too steep. Lower radar visibility meant strange shapes, reduced payloads, less speed, and crucially, they believed radar would always adapt. You could shrink the signature, but never erase it. There would always be a signal, always a trace, until Baghdad, 1991. The F-117 wasn't just invisible to radar, it was invisible to their entire theory of defense. The aircraft had no afterburner, no radar of its own. It carried only laser-guided bombs and relied on precise intelligence gathered days in advance. It flew at night, alone, and on a pre-planned path. In doctrine terms, it broke every model. The concept of radar denial wasn't new, but never had it been this complete. The F-117 wasn't just stealthy. It was built to weaponize invisibility. Meanwhile, the Soviet-inspired defenses in Iraq were built to counter volume. Mass raids, swarms of aircraft. Their response was saturation. Fill the skies with shrapnel, missiles, and jamming beams. But what do you aim at when there's nothing to track? What do you intercept when the sky is quiet until the bomb hits? This wasn't a gap in response. It was a revelation. That the future of warfare wouldn't be determined by how much you could shoot, but how well you could hide. The Soviets had built their air defenses to fight what they understood. Now they were fighting something that didn't exist on paper. And worse, they had no countermeasure. At exactly 2:38 a.m., Baghdad time, the first explosion ripped through the Al-Taji military communications complex north of the city. A split second later, the headquarters of the Republican Guard was hit with a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb. Within the next 10 minutes, 6 more precision strikes ignited across Baghdad, each on a hardened target, each struck with terrifying accuracy. What radar crews could not explain, what Soviet officers refused to believe, was that not one of those strikes had been preceded by a radar return. No aircraft had been tracked. No missile had been launched. The integrated air defense system, designed with overlapping SAM fields, AAA rings, and early warning radars, had never even responded. Inside one of Baghdad's primary air operations centers, manned by Soviet-trained technicians, red phones rang with escalating confusion. Officers screamed for radar relays. SAM commanders demanded coordinates, and batteries fired into the night sky without targeting data, pure desperation. And still, nothing appeared on screen. Far above, at 25,000 feet, An F-117, a Nighthawk banked westward, engines whisper quiet, its infrared signature barely above ambient. It had just delivered its payload, turned clean, and exited the area, undetected. The only indication of its presence was the smoke curling from the demolished building below. To the Soviet observers embedded with Iraqi units, this wasn't an isolated failure, it was an impossible event. How could the most densely protected capital in the Arab world, defended by Soviet missiles, radar, and doctrine, suffer coordinated destruction without a single air contact logged? The answer, terrifying in its simplicity. The attackers had never been visible to begin with. At least 9 F-117 seconds had entered the Baghdad defense zone that night. None were intercepted. None were even seen. They struck hardened targets, crippled air command infrastructure, and left radar networks burning. By dawn, the full scale of the assault was evident. 20 key installations damaged or destroyed, communications severed, command silos flattened, Iraqi defense minister phones rang unanswered, and inside the Soviet embassy, GRU officers sent a terse flash report back to Moscow. Unknown technology defeated radar detection. Immediate reassessment required. But reassessment wasn't enough. Because this wasn't a single incident. It was a proof of concept. Stealth had not just arrived, it had just decapitated a Soviet-built defense network in a single night. And it had done so without loss, without resistance, and without leaving a trace on the very systems that were supposed to stop it. Baghdad was not just bombed, it had been invisibly dismantled. In the first hours after the Baghdad strikes, the Soviet High Command received scattered reports from GRU field agents and technical observers embedded with Iraqi air defense units. The content was bizarre, and for a moment, completely dismissed. Command centers destroyed, with no radar contact. SAM sites still intact, but never fired. Bunkers leveled, without a single aircraft intercepted. The official line in Moscow was firm. This must be American disinformation. High-level officers at the Soviet General Staff, many of whom had built their careers on the very doctrines that had just failed, argued that the GRU reports were mistaken. Misreadings, jamming, a psyop to demoralize the Eastern Bloc. After all, stealth aircraft weren't truly invisible, they were simply harder to see. And in a city as saturated with radar as Baghdad, something should have been visible. So, they called for verification. Reconnaissance satellites were repositioned. Intelligence-gathering submarines in the Mediterranean listened to encrypted NATO comms. Field agents queried Iraqi counterparts. The results were consistent and damning. Western news outlets had already broadcast footage of bombed bunkers and burning radars. And yet, no footage showed jets or dogfights. Just quiet, then impact. In one internal KGB briefing, a general slapped down a satellite photo of Baghdad's Ministry of Defense split cleanly in half. He asked how it was possible that a nation could strike such a target, with such precision, and yet trigger no alarms, no counterfire, no visual confirmation. The room was silent. The consensus, one still whispered, never admitted, was chilling. The Americans had built a ghost plane. Still, the Soviet response was denial. Not to the outside world, but to themselves. To accept that the F-117 had worked perfectly meant admitting that billions of rubles worth of radar systems, missile networks, and training doctrines were now obsolete. It meant that everything they had promised their allies, Baghdad, Damascus, Havana, was a lie. A lie not out of malice, but out of ignorance. So they delayed the reckoning. Soviet state press ran vague articles about American technological escalation. Military journals speculated about new electronic warfare tricks, drones, or decoy units. Anything but stealth. Anything but the truth. Yet in closed-door defense briefings, another tone was creeping in, quiet, sharp, undeniable. A colonel from the PVO Air Defense Forces said it best. We were not blind because of jamming. We were blind because they disappeared before our eyes. Moscow could pretend nothing had changed. But Baghdad had already changed everything. Desperate for answers, Soviet advisors in Baghdad and analysts in Moscow began to construct theories, most of them wrong. The idea that an aircraft could simply bypass an entire defense network didn't fit their models. So they assumed something else had to be at play. The first wrong theory? Jamming. They postulated that the Americans had deployed a massive electronic warfare campaign, an airborne wall of static and deception. In this model, F-117 seconds weren't invisible, merely shielded by aggressive jamming aircraft flying ahead or alongside. Soviet planners theorized that Growlers, EC 130 seconds, or satellites had scrambled radar returns, flooding the Iraqi network with false echoes. The concept was familiar. It explained the chaos without requiring new physics. Orders were given to shift radar frequencies. Multiple SAM sites recalibrated their systems, attempting to break through what they believed was an electronic fog. But the theory collapsed the next night. More targets were destroyed. More F-117 seconds returned untouched. And none of the radars, newly tuned, coordinated with fail-safes, saw a thing. The second hypothesis emerged. Stealth was a trick of timing. Maybe the F-117 seconds flew low, hugging terrain, slipping in through valleys or radar dead zones. Perhaps the strikes occurred during radar handovers, between coverage gaps, exploiting known weaknesses in Soviet-designed systems. It would be humiliating but not catastrophic. Iraqi officers repositioned mobile radar units. AAA batteries were redirected. But again, nothing changed. Then came the most desperate idea. The Americans were using drones, high-speed, stealthy decoys, to confuse radar and draw fire, while real aircraft struck unseen. But every impact site was consistent with a piloted, precision-guided munition. No wreckage of drones, no signal intercepts, and still no contact. In Soviet air defense theory, invisibility didn't exist. Every radar had its limits, but nothing was truly immune. Aircraft could be stealthier, yes. Smaller, yes. But gone? Ghost-like? That possibility wasn't considered. It wasn't modeled. And so, they searched for a logical explanation that never came. What they didn't know, what they refused to admit, was that the wrong theory was the point. Because the F-117 had not come to challenge their systems. It had come to render their systems irrelevant. And in trying to decode what had happened over Baghdad, Soviet advisors were not unraveling a mystery. They were clinging to a dying worldview. With jamming dismissed and stealth still deemed implausible, Soviet and Iraqi analysts turned to a more human explanation: betrayal. The theory went like this: someone inside Iraq had helped the Americans. Perhaps coordinates had been leaked. Perhaps American agents had tampered with radar systems. The strikes were too precise. The timings too synchronized. No defense network could be that thoroughly bypassed unless someone had unlocked the door from the inside. GRU officers, now embarrassed by their inability to explain what was happening, leaned into this theory with quiet desperation. They cited oddities. A radar unit that was offline for maintenance just hours before the first strike. An intercepted radio message garbled with odd syntax. An officer who failed to report a system check on time. It was compelling because it preserved the illusion that the system hadn't failed. People had. Mistrust crept through the ranks. Iraqi radar crews were interrogated. Soviet instructors questioned their trainees more aggressively. Passwords were changed. Authentication procedures doubled. Security protocols in Baghdad's command and control centers became suffocating. Officers who had worked side by side for years now exchanged glances of suspicion, but the bombs kept falling, and the radars kept seeing nothing. If treachery was to blame, it was a strangely consistent one. Across multiple cities, in different weather conditions, with different crews, the results were the same. F-117 seconds arrived, struck key targets, and vanished, all without detection, all without resistance. Eventually, the logic broke. Too many variables, too many locations, too much devastation. Even if betrayal explained one attack, it could not explain them all. By day 4, Even senior Iraqi generals privately admitted the truth. There was no traitor. There was only an enemy they could not see. One Soviet colonel, speaking under coded channel from Baghdad, summarized it in a chilling message to Moscow. No sabotage. No leak. No drone. These are aircraft that do not exist on radar. Our systems are not jammed. They are bypassed. Still, the denial clung tight. Better to believe in human failure than technological irrelevance. Better to root out ghosts than to face the nightmare of stealth supremacy. Because to admit the F-117 was real and operational was to accept that every Soviet-aligned air defense system across the world had just been made obsolete overnight. This wasn't betrayal. It was a preview. For over a decade, Soviet intelligence had monitored American aerospace projects with near-religious diligence. Spy satellites captured blurry images of hangars in Nevada, human assets in U.S. Defense contractors reported whispers of new black programs. The KGB's first directorate gathered vague clues about experimental aircraft, odd shapes, flying wings, radar-absorbing materials. But it wasn't enough. Because none of it predicted this. The F-117A didn't just slip through Soviet early warning networks, it slipped past the entire Soviet intelligence apparatus. Before Desert Storm, the CIA's stealth efforts were one of the most tightly guarded secrets in U.S. military history. Officially, the F-117 didn't exist. It wasn't shown in parades, didn't perform flybys, and never appeared in publicly acknowledged deployments. When the aircraft was spotted in transit, it was covered in tarps or flown at night. Pilots were sworn to secrecy. Ground crews were compartmentalized. The Soviets had seen hints, odd-shaped wind tunnel models, suspicious airfields with limited access, and cryptic budget lines in U.S. procurement documents. Some GRU analysts had even guessed at the shape of the F-117 from classified photographs and open-source reports. But the pieces never formed a coherent threat profile. They knew something might exist, but not what it could do, and certainly not what it had become. In their assessments, stealth was still theoretical, limited, fragile. The idea that the U had already built, tested, and deployed a fleet of operational stealth aircraft ready for precision bombing at intercontinental range was dismissed as fantasy. That was the fatal flaw. Because while Soviet engineers built better radars, the Americans built planes that could ignore radars altogether. The consequence wasn't just a tactical surprise, it was a strategic shock. When the phone 117 seconds struck Baghdad, they revealed that the United States had not only leaped a generation ahead in aerial warfare, it had done so without the Soviets even realizing it. This was not just a missed estimate. It was a catastrophic failure of vision, the kind of failure that shakes empires. At KGB headquarters, post-strike analysis reports were filled with contradictions. Technical officers claimed no aircraft could evade their newest radar systems. Field agents insisted something invisible had flown over their heads. Disinformation divisions scrambled to plant narratives that blamed sabotage, drones, or luck. But behind closed doors, the admission came quiet, bitter, and final. They built something we cannot see, and we cannot stop. The Soviet Union had underestimated the U.S. stealth program not because of arrogance, but because their worldview couldn't contain the truth. They believed in interception. America believed in invisibility. To the outside world, the F-117 was a marvel of aerospace engineering, black, angular, and nearly invisible to radar. But that image, seductive as it was, missed the true story. The real weapon wasn't the aircraft. It was the system that delivered it. America's stealth success in Baghdad wasn't the result of a single platform, or even a single doctrine. It was the convergence of intelligence, design, logistics, and digital command in a way the Soviet Union had never imagined. And it began long before the first bomb dropped. It started in the desert at a secret test range known only to a handful of insiders, where Lockheed's Skunk Works built the F-117 under a veil of absolute secrecy. There, Engineers didn't try to reduce radar signature, they tried to erase it. They designed the aircraft like a mirror to radar waves, bouncing energy away from enemy sensors. Every angle, every panel, every bolt had one purpose: denial of detection. But stealth alone wasn't enough. The aircraft had no radar. It couldn't dogfight. It wasn't fast. It needed perfect intelligence, perfect targeting, and perfect timing. So America built everything around it. Before the war, satellites mapped Baghdad to the centimeter. Human agents inside Iraq identified weak points in communication networks. Spy planes flew signals, intelligence sweeps. Analysts in the Pentagon created strike packages that accounted for everything from the enemy's radar coverage to the atmospheric conditions that might affect infrared tracking. Every F-117 mission was a digital ballet. AWACS provided real-time battlefield control. RC-135 rivet joint aircraft listened for electronic emissions. Tankers were pre-positioned to extend loiter time. And, if a radar ever flickered on, Wild Weasel SEAD units were already tracking it with HARM missiles locked. The F-117 wasn't just invisible, it was untouchable, because it operated inside a digital mesh that stretched from space to cockpit. Meanwhile, Soviet doctrine remained analog. Their systems were rigid, layered, and built for mass. One radar fed into another, one missile battery backed up the next. It was dense, but dumb, powerful, but slow. Against volume raids, it could perform. Against precision, it fell apart. In Iraq, that difference became fatal. Every time an F-117 took off, it was the final node in a global network. And when it struck, it didn't just destroy a building. It deleted a command node, a communication relay, a brainstem. Soviet-style defense relied on those nodes to function. Once cut, the entire system unraveled. Even more chilling was the silence. No engine roar, no radio chatter, no radar spikes. Just impact. This was the true American system. Not stealth planes, but stealth warfare. A war where you don't fight the enemy directly. You remove their ability to respond. To Soviet planners, the implication was terrifying. Because if one plane could do that, what happens when it's no longer one? What happens when it's a fleet? What happens when it's doctrine? On the fifth night of the bombing campaign, a single F-117 dropped a laser-guided bomb onto the roof of Iraq's Air Force headquarters. The strike collapsed the top 3 floors, killing dozens of staff, including several Soviet-trained air defense planners. No alarms had sounded. No interceptors had scrambled. The building simply ceased to exist, and so did Iraq's aerial coordination. To Soviet observers embedded with Iraqi units, this wasn't warfare. It was surgical humiliation. Across Baghdad, Soviet-designed defense systems, once the pride of export diplomacy, were failing in real time. SA-2 and SA-3 missile sites fired blindly. Search radars flickered and fell silent. Anti-aircraft artillery filled the night sky with angry metal, only to hit nothing. When wreckage did fall from above, it was rarely American. More often, it was their own radar dishes, crushed by collapsing towers. The most advanced Soviet export radars, including P-12 Spoonrest and P-18 Spoonrest-D, were outmatched. Their detection ranges, once advertised as fearsome, proved useless against targets they couldn't lock. Even low-frequency tracking systems, designed to spot stealth, failed due to poor coordination and signal clutter. The result was a battlefield lit by explosions but blind in every direction. Inside Soviet military circles, the humiliation grew worse. Field agents had warned of this possibility years ago. Some GRU analysts had flagged the odd budget lines, the glimpses of angular prototypes in Nevada, the strange reports from test ranges, but they'd been ignored, mocked, discouraged from making exaggerated Western assessments. Now, they watched as a doctrine died on screen. The worst moment came not on the battlefield but in the living rooms of Soviet officers, watching CNN. Broadcasts showed Baghdad's skyline lit by explosions, Reporters whispered under their breath as targets blew apart with pinpoint accuracy. And yet, no sirens, no defensive fire, no jet trails, just silence followed by impact. The message was undeniable. America didn't need to fight Soviet systems anymore. It could walk past them. In closed-door meetings, Soviet generals offered vague statements of surprise capability and temporary blind spots. But within the officer corps, the reality was clear. The entire PVO, the Soviet Air Defense Forces, had been conceptually defeated. Every export contract, every alliance promise, every impenetrable umbrella claim had been invalidated overnight. And worse, the Americans had done it without losing a single F-117. By the 10th night, Iraqi generals stopped asking for radar updates. They simply waited for the next explosion. Soviet advisors, once honored guests, were now silent observers. They could offer no help, no fix, no answer. Just a quiet acknowledgement of a battlefield they no longer understood. The war was still raging, but the battle for credibility, it was already lost. By the end of the first week, something had broken not just in Baghdad's defense grid, but in the minds of Soviet strategists. For 40 years, Soviet doctrine had emphasized depth, layered radars, massed missiles, redundancy, a fortress of firepower. The belief was simple: you could not hide from the Soviet machine. But now, in Baghdad, America had not hidden. It had simply bypassed everything. The F-117's success was not just tactical, it was ideological. It signaled a paradigm shift that Moscow was utterly unprepared for. Soviet planners had believed in volume. More radar, more missiles, more interceptors. The Americans had invested in something else: precision, invisibility, and networked dominance. The very idea of a stealth aircraft, something designed not to survive detection, but to avoid it entirely, had been dismissed for years as a Western fantasy. And yet, the reality was undeniable. 6 targets hit in one night, dozens more the following week. And no Soviet-trained system had stopped a single one. Back in Moscow, internal reports were grim. One classified briefing to the general staff concluded, "Our air defense theory must be rewritten from first principles." The implications rippled through the Soviet defense industry. Long-term radar development projects were suddenly obsolete. Export deals with nations like Syria, Libya, and Cuba came under quiet review. Allies began to question the value of Soviet hardware. Why buy a missile system that couldn't see its target? Even worse, NATO had seen it too. For decades, the USSR had counted on deterrence. Now, that deterrence had a hole. If America could strike capital cities, leadership bunkers, and hardened command posts without detection, what did that mean for strategic parity? What did it mean for the survival of Soviet leadership in the opening hours of a conflict? The psychological toll was massive. It wasn't just that the USSR had been outmatched. It was that the rules had changed, and they hadn't been told. Years of centralized planning, of massive radar grids, of doctrines drilled into generations of officers, all rendered irrelevant by a single aircraft and a war they didn't even start. Soviet generals weren't just defeated in Baghdad. They were conceptually disarmed. And the worst realization came not from what the F-117 was, but from what it meant was coming next. Because if America could make one aircraft invisible, what else had they built in the dark? Years after the Gulf War ended, the F-117 was declassified, sort of. It began appearing at air shows, rolling down runways under Nevada sunlight. But for those who had faced it in the darkness over Baghdad, its shape was already burned into memory. To Soviet officers, the F-117 wasn't an aircraft. It was a ghost. A reminder that their empire's greatest defense, the air shield they had spent decades building, had been pierced by something they never saw, never tracked, never understood. A machine that, even when revealed, still felt like myth. In Russia, former radar engineers quietly began reworking theories. New low-frequency arrays were designed, stealth detection cells were funded, and academic journals began debating the role of quantum radar. But it was too late. The paradigm had shifted. The Cold War had ended not with a nuclear standoff, but with a surgical strike. Not with mass formations, but with absence. The F-117 was not the most powerful jet, not the fastest, not the most heavily armed. But it redefined power because it forced the world to accept a new truth, that what you cannot see can still destroy you. Today, the F-117 is retired, its legacy absorbed by newer designs, B-2 Spirits, F-22 Raptors, and the F-35 Lightning II. But its silhouette still haunts enemy planning rooms, not because of what it did, but because of what it proved. That American warfare no longer relied on attrition. It relied on ghosts, signals, and silence. And while Soviet air defenses had once ruled by volume, range, and reach, the future belonged to those who could vanish, strike, and disappear before a siren ever sounded. The F-117 didn't just bomb Baghdad, it buried an era.